My name is David, and a long time ago I used to work the night shift at a small gas station out in the middle of nowhere. When I say the middle of nowhere, I mean exactly that. There wasn't much around except a long stretch of highway, a few scattered houses miles apart, and the occasional truck stop a few exits down. This was years ago, back before every little store had high-definition cameras watching every inch of the property. Security systems existed, sure, but they weren't as common as they are today. The owner of the place was also unbelievably cheap, so installing anything expensive was the last thing on his mind. Honestly though, I didn't really care. The job was ridiculously easy. Most nights I was the only person there from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. Customers were rare after midnight, and sometimes hours would pass without a single person walking through the door. The hardest part of the job wasn't the work itself. It was dealing with the owner. That guy had the memory of a goldfish. We would argue about the same things over and over again. I'm not exaggerating either. We'd have a disagreement about something on Monday, settle it, and then by Wednesday, he'd bring it up again like it had never happened before. It was like every conversation we had just disappeared from his brain the moment it ended. But aside from that annoyance, the job was mostly peaceful. My usual routine was simple. I'd lean against the counter, flip through a magazine, maybe drink too much coffee, and wait for the rare customer to wander in. One night, during the week I think, I was doing exactly that. I was leaning back behind the counter with a magazine in my hands, trying to stay awake. The store was dead quiet. So quiet that the faint buzzing sound from the old fluorescent lights was the only noise in the entire building. If you've ever worked somewhere like that at night, you know the sound I'm talking about. That low electric hum that never really stops. After a while, your brain just tunes it out. So when the front door suddenly chimed, the noise nearly made me jump out of my skin. I looked up toward the entrance. A man had just walked inside. At first, nothing about him seemed too unusual. He was tall, probably in his 30s, and had a solid build. My first thought was that he might have been a former athlete or something like that. But then I noticed something. Actually, I noticed a lot of something. The guy was covered in blood. And I mean covered. There was a huge dark red splatter across the front of his shirt. Streaks ran down his arms and across his face. Even his hands looked soaked in it. For a few seconds, my brain just stopped working. The amount of blood was almost cartoonish. It was so extreme that my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It didn't fit into any normal category of experience. Was it paint? Was it some kind of joke? No. Deep down, I knew exactly what it was, but the strangest part wasn't the blood. It was his face. More specifically, his eyes. They looked completely empty. There was no panic, no fear, no anger, nothing. He walked into the store like it was just another ordinary night. Like he had just stopped in to buy a soda on the way home from work. It was bizarre. I couldn't stop staring at him. Every time I forced myself to glance away, my eyes drifted right back to him again. It was like my brain was stuck trying to figure out what I was looking at. Eventually he noticed. Of course he noticed. I was practically gawking at him. He looked straight at me and then, to my surprise, he smiled. And in the calmest voice imaginable, he said, "Relax, it's not my blood." That was supposed to make things better, I guess. It didn't. If anything, it made the situation even worse. My mind immediately jumped to the most obvious conclusion. If it wasn't his blood, then whose was it? Suddenly, all the alarms in my head were going off. This guy might have just killed someone. And now he was standing 10 feet away from me. For a moment, I was completely frozen. But then instinct kicked in. I forced myself to act normal. I nodded like he had just made some casual comment about the weather, then looked back down at my magazine. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched him move through the aisles. He grabbed a few random items. Snacks, I think. Maybe a drink. The whole time he moved slowly and casually, like nothing strange was happening at all. Eventually, he walked up to the counter. I rang up the items without saying much. To be honest, I was surprised he was even paying for them. If he had just walked out with everything, I probably wouldn't have tried to stop him. He pulled out some cash and set it on the counter. Still calm, still quiet. I made sure not to look him in the eyes again. I just wanted the whole thing to be over. A few seconds later, the register drawer closed. He grabbed his bag and walked toward the door. The bell chimed again. And just like that, he was gone. I stood there for a second, barely breathing. Then I heard a car engine start somewhere in the parking lot. The moment I heard it drive away, I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. My hands were shaking as I tried to explain what had just happened. I told the dispatcher that a man had walked into the store covered in blood. I gave them the best description I could remember. The dispatcher started asking questions. Where did he go? Did he say anything else? Did I see a vehicle? I was in the middle of answering one of those questions when the front door chimed again. My heart sank. Another customer was the last thing I wanted right then. But when I looked up, it wasn't a customer. It was him, the same man. And this time he looked furious. The moment he saw me holding the phone, his expression changed completely. I hung up as fast as I could, but it was already too late. He had seen everything. He stormed straight up to the counter. His voice was loud and angry now. Did you call the cops? I shook my head immediately. No. But he didn't believe me. Not even for a second. He started shouting, accusing me of lying, telling me to mind my own business. I raised my hands in a calming gesture, trying to keep things from escalating. But it wasn't working. His anger was building fast. Before I could even react, he suddenly jumped. And when I say jumped, I mean he launched himself across the counter. 1 second he was standing on the other side of it. The next second he was tackling me to the floor. Everything happened so fast it barely felt real. We crashed onto the ground and instantly he was on top of me, his hands wrapped around my throat. He started strangling me. I had never been in a real fight before that night. But in that moment, instinct took over. I kicked, scratched, punched, anything I could do to get him off me. His blood, or whoever's blood it was smearing all over my clothes and face as we struggled. My lungs burned as I tried to breathe. I honestly thought I was about to die right there on the floor of that gas station. Desperate, I shouted the first thing that came to mind. I've got a gun. It was a complete bluff. There was no gun anywhere in that store. But something about the way I said it must have sounded convincing, because suddenly he froze. For a split second, we just stared at each other. Then he scrambled off me and ran for the door. The bell rang as he burst outside. A second later, I heard tires screeching as his car sped out of the parking lot. I stayed on the floor for a long time after that. My body ached, my throat burned, and I was covered in blood that wasn't even mine. About 10 minutes later, the police finally arrived. When they saw the condition I was in, they immediately rushed back out to try and track the guy down. But as far as I know, they never found him. I never heard anything about the incident again. No news reports, no follow-up calls, nothing. For a long time, I assumed that was the craziest thing that would ever happen to me. But a few months later, something even stranger happened. And to this day, I still don't know what any of it meant. A few months passed after that night, and eventually life started to feel normal again. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Looking back now, the smart thing would have been to quit that job immediately. But at the time, I needed the money. And part of me had convinced myself that what happened was just a freak incident. Something crazy that would probably never happen again. So I stayed. The nights went back to being slow and quiet. I fell back into the same routine: coffee, magazines, and long stretches of silence broken only by the buzzing fluorescent lights. For a while, nothing unusual happened. Then one night, something did. It was another late shift, almost identical to the night of the attack. The store was empty, the road outside was dark, and I was standing behind the counter flipping through the magazine to pass the time. That's when the door chimed. I glanced up casually, expecting a truck driver or maybe someone passing through town. But the man who walked in immediately caught my attention. The first thing I noticed was the suit. Not just any suit either. This thing looked expensive. Dark gray, perfectly fitted and clearly tailored. The kind of suit you'd expect to see in a corporate boardroom or at some upscale event. It looked completely out of place inside a small gas station in the middle of nowhere, especially after midnight. For a moment, I assumed he must have been coming from a wedding or some kind of formal event nearby. That was the only explanation that made sense. But even then, people like that usually don't stop at random gas stations in remote areas. The guy didn't browse the aisles. He didn't grab a drink. He didn't even glance around the store. Instead, he walked straight up to the counter. He never said hello, never smiled. He didn't even make eye contact at first. Without a word, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a photograph. Then he placed it on the counter in front of me. At first, I was confused. But when I looked down at the photo, my stomach dropped. It was a picture of the man who had attacked me. The same guy who had walked into the store covered in blood months earlier. The image wasn't perfectly clear, but it was definitely him. I recognized the face immediately. For a second, I just stared at the photograph. Then I slowly looked back up. The man in the suit was watching me closely. He hadn't spoken yet. He was just studying my face like he was trying to read my thoughts. The silence stretched on long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke. His voice surprised me. It was rough and gravelly, like someone who had smoked too many cigarettes for too many years. "Have you ever seen this man before?" The question hung in the air. My brain immediately started racing. There was no badge, no identification. Nothing that suggested he was a police officer or a detective. But something about him felt official. At the same time, something about him felt wrong. My gut instinct screamed one thing: deny everything. So I shook my head. No, I've never seen him. The man didn't react. He didn't nod. He didn't argue. He just stared at me. Those cold eyes stayed locked on my face like he was analyzing every tiny movement. The silence that followed felt unbearable. Every passing second made me less confident about my answer. Still, I didn't change my story. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the man reached down and picked up the photograph. Without saying another word, he turned and started walking toward the exit. The moment he turned his back, I let out a slow breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I thought the encounter was over, but right before he reached the door, he stopped. Slowly, he turned around. He looked straight at me, and in the same gravelly voice, he said, "I know you're lying." Then he walked out. Just like that. The bell above the door chimed and he disappeared into the night. I stood there frozen for a moment. My mind was racing with questions. Who was that guy? How did he know about the man who attacked me? Was he a cop? A private investigator? Or something else entirely? The possibility that bothered me the most was the last one. If he wasn't law enforcement, that meant he might be connected to whatever the blood-covered man had been involved in. And that was not something I wanted any part of. I considered calling the police that night, but the memory of what happened the last time I called them stopped me. The situation had nearly gotten me killed. So instead, I stayed quiet. Days passed, then weeks. At first, nothing happened, but eventually I started noticing something strange. A silver SUV. The first time I saw it, it was parked across the street from the gas station during one of my daytime shifts. That alone wasn't unusual. Cars came and went all the time. But then I started seeing the same SUV in other places. A few days later, it was in the parking lot of the grocery store where I did my shopping. Another time, I spotted it parked down the street near my apartment building. At first, I told myself it was probably just a coincidence. But after seeing it several times over the course of 2 weeks, the alarm bells in my head started ringing again. I had a pretty strong feeling about who it belonged to, the man in the suit. Somehow he had found out where I lived, and the thought of that made my skin crawl. I started telling myself that the next time I saw the SUV, I would call the police. But I never did. Part of me hoped that if I just ignored it, whatever this situation was would eventually fade away. That turned out to be a terrible plan. About 3 weeks after the man in the suit first showed up at the gas station, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of breaking glass. The noise was loud enough to snap me awake instantly. My heart was pounding as I jumped out of bed. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the mattress and rushed into the living room. My apartment was small, so it only took a few seconds to scan the entire place. No one was inside, but something was. In the middle of the living room floor, surrounded by shattered glass, was a rock, about the size of a fist. It had clearly been thrown through the window. There was no note attached to it, no message written on it. But I didn't need one. I understood exactly what it meant. Someone was sending me a message, and I had a pretty good idea who it was. That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep living like that. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what those men were involved in, and I didn't want to find out. The next day, I quit my job at the gas station. Within a few weeks, I found a small apartment in another town and moved out. For a while, I stayed on edge, expecting something else to happen. But nothing did. I never saw the silver SUV again. Eventually, I started to relax. A year later, I moved even farther away, to another state entirely. Life went on, but every now and then, I still think about those 2 nights. The man covered in blood, the man in the suit, and the strange chain of events that followed. For years, I assumed I would never come close to experiencing anything that terrifying again. But about 8 months ago, something happened on a highway late at night that made those memories come rushing back in a way I never expected. And this time, it was even worse.